Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me. Today we're going to be connecting Cuba. This is the goal of my project is to provide a real-time case study of digital forward companies as they attempt to enter America's reclusive neighbor to the south of Florida, Cuba, and determine best practices from these companies such that future entrants can learn from their successes and avoid some of their failures. I'm going to cover three primary points today. Just give a brief overview of Cuba since Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution took over in the 1950s and bring us up to date on the digital infrastructure constraints that Cuba is still experiencing as a result of the political situation. The second point is exploring the solution space. I want to look at three prongs of solutions. There are technology-focused opportunities. There are strategic choices that companies can make to deal with these constraints. And then we're going to jump into specific case studies that the tech giants of the world, Airbnb, Google, and Microsoft, have used to either enter Cuba or enter developing countries that have many parallels with Cuba. Finally, we're going to summarize with a couple of takeaways, and let's go ahead and jump right in. In the interest of time, I'm going to assume that everyone passed AP History and breezed through a lot of this. The main thing we need to keep in mind are the rapprochements that the final years of the Obama administration sort of kicked off with the new Castro government. So after years of illness, Fidel finally stepped down and his younger brother Raul took over before he passed away in late 2016. And since these rapprochements have begun, we're seeing incremental restrictions being loosened, but the Cuban embargo that's been in place since the mid-1950s is still in act today, so we have a ways to go. To bring us up to date on Cuba's digital challenges, I think it really comes down to three primary points as far as Cubans' access to the internet and the digital economy as a whole. The first is obviously speed. Cuba suffers from some of the slowest speeds on the planet. They're in the bottom 5th percentile according to speed test results that were conducted in the past couple of years. There are basically very limited connections to the backbone today, primarily an aging satellite internet that adds about half a second of latency, which is pretty prohibitory when you're thinking of real-time video and the applications we know and love today. The only hardwired link to the internet was fiber link to Venezuela up until this past year, when there has actually been a small telecom in Florida, CNW Networks, providing a link to the United States for the first time since the embargo began. However, average speeds remain around a megabit per second in most locations. Cost is the second biggest the biggest kind of prohibitory factor we have to consider. The average Cuban makes approximately $20 or $30 a month on their government paychecks, and it costs $2 per hour to access the network. So 10% of your monthly salary is just strictly cost prohibitory for many Cubans. You are kind of forced to sign up for these prepaid Wi-Fi cards. They're somewhat hard to find unless you're a tourist, and so if you are someone who has access to these cards, you'll typically buy up a ton and then sell them at an upcharge around these public Wi-Fi hotspots. The third prohibitory point we have to consider is just access in general. There are about 318 public Wi-Fi stations today. The government does have a plan to sort of quickly ramp up this number by 2020, but we can all guess how reliable the Cuban government's projections as far as a project like this would be. And this is only covering about 5% of the population today. There have been a number of public sector proposals throughout the history of Cuba that I wanted to touch on really quickly. The first was the Cuban Future Project, and this was Fidel's attempt during the special period of the 90s, which was basically a famine in Cuba. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Cubans really struggled to really meet their basic needs, but this was one of Fidel's attempted stimulus packages to sort of spur the Cuban economy to grow through growing the software sector. The results have not been very successful. Despite this program's 20-year lifespan, we've only got about 5,000 people employed in the government tech sector today, and they're making very similar salaries to other industries where there's just not enough of a benefit there to spur more desire to enter this sector. On the US side, there's an act that has been proposed to Congress, the Data Act, or Digital and Telecommunications Advancement Act. It was a bill proposed by the Senate in 2015 that would further the rapprochements in the telecom sector specifically. Right now, there are a number of prohibitions on telecommunications devices specifically because they tend to contain things like encryption algorithms and proprietary software that the US government doesn't necessarily want to get into unfriendly hands. Unfortunately, despite rare bipartisan support, that bill has been tied up since 2015 in committee. Now let's jump into a few tech-focused solutions that I think have major potential to make an impact in Cuba. Facebook's Connectivity Lab is working on a number of revolutionary wireless technologies. I think two of the most promising ones are Project Ares and Project Telegraph. Basically, these are next-generation wireless technologies. Envision the network that your cell phone runs on, but they are better suited for urban geographies in particular. They make more efficient use of the network spectrum and can carry more bandwidth with the same amount of spectrum. Google X is working on some very futuristic, cool stuff. I'm sure all the Googlers in the room are aware of Project Link and Project Loon. They have scaled back to some extent in recent years as far as how much investment they're pouring into these projects. However, I think they still hold major promise. One of the major limits here is that countries where Loon has been piloted, there tends to be a private sector telecom company that Google can go in and partner with, leverage that existing infrastructure on the ground, such that they're really only relying on these balloons to sort of beam existing connectivity to rural areas where it's not available before, but they do rely on that existing provider. And I'm not sure if the Cuban state-run telecom is quite there yet as far as potential. A few other projects in the space that you can look at if you are interested is Google's Project Link. There's a new 5G wireless standard coming that the US telecoms expect to have rolled out by 2020. And also, there's what's called low Earth orbit satellite networks, which is sort of the next generation of satellite technology that would be much lower latency and higher speed than Cuba's networks today. Now I want to jump into a few case studies of companies that have either successfully entered Cuba or successfully entered developing countries that have parallels to Cuba. And this quick 2x2 I threw together to help me kind of visualize the local tailoring that companies are making to their product offerings to make them specific to Cuba. And on the vertical axis, we also have the completeness of product offerings. The companies I explored ran the gamut of everyone from individual app providers like Skype, Microsoft Skype obviously, to the conglomerates of the world that have a full suite of products and may only consider offering one or two at a time in a country like Cuba, such as Google. The first case study I want to jump into is Airbnb. I think this has been one of the most successful entrants to Cuba to date for a couple reasons. I think the primary is the degree of local tailoring they were willing to undertake. Basically, they entered in 2015 and utilized an existing network that the Cuban government had already built up in the 90s. Tourism has been one of the biggest industries in Cuba for many decades now, and the government has put in significant investment to protect that industry by registering this network of 20,000 some homes that Airbnb could basically piggyback in. 4,000 of those 20,000 are now listed on the site, and this has been one of the most successful US-focused tech giants to enter Cuba today. Some Airbnb hosts report as much as 90% of their bookings are coming through the Airbnb site. Before, they were having to use sort of the old-fashioned middleman travel agent approach, whereas now, if I want to go to Cuba, which I do, can go on Airbnb and book those sites. One of the major caveats they've had to make is continuing to use a middleman to deal with the actual hosting side. So, since there is no electronics payment infrastructure in place in Cuba today, Cubans are still having to rely on a hosting partner to both find wireless connectivity in public locations around urban areas and handle the payments with the hosts in cash. Typically within a week of a guest stay, they'll receive payment in cash. The second case study I looked at was Google, and Google has obviously a suite of products that we all know and love, and they've done a very good job of incrementally ramping up their product offerings in Cuba. So they started off with what I like to think of as sort of a marketing campaign in Cuba. They launched Google Chrome, Play Store, and Google Analytics tools and made them available to anyone who could get an internet connection in Cuba way back in 2014, even before Obama announced some of the kind of easing of relations with Cuba. And they've also done a good job of establishing local partnerships. They handed out Chromebooks and Google Cardboard in local Havana museums such that locals and tourists could sort of experience this next generation of technology. Another infrastructure provision they've made is the installation of Google global cache servers in and around Havana in recent years. And this did require a partnership with the local telecom. Basically a cache server, so you can think of Google's network in 3 layers. They have the core data centers, which host content such as the YouTube videos we all frequent. The edge points of service are basically where those data centers would intersect with the large telecoms in the States, like the AT&Ts of the world. And then finally, the caching servers put that content closer to, from the network's perspective, closer to the end user, such that when you look at the same video your neighbor's looking at on YouTube, you don't have to go all the way to Google's core network to access it. You can access it from your local cache server. This server supposedly went online early in 2017, but Google's actually not showing it fully operational today. So let's hope this comes online sometime in the near future so that Cubans can get their dose of cat videos like we all have. The final case study I wanted to look at is actually non-Cuba focused, but I think it is very applicable to this geography. It's Microsoft's Skype Lite. They basically released a thin version of the popular video and voice chat communication app we all know and love that is optimized for slower networks, 2G networks, particularly in India, same technology that is present today in Cuba. And it's also just a smaller app size, so the data constraints are not as great if you're looking to download Skype Lite. I think Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella had a great quote where he sort of called out the competitor in their space, which is Google, that basically says, my ambition with connectivity is not to fly balloons in national aerospace of other countries, but to enable the local entrepreneurs to have low-cost connectivity solutions. So Satya sees this as kind of a more viable sort of low-level solution that would provide real value to Cubans on the ground that have limits as far as their internet access. There are future plans to sort of turn this into a platform, at least in India, and build out this authentication service called Aadhaar for identity verification for things like job interviews and the like. So in summary, I have 5 takeaways after looking at this suite of companies. Public-private partnerships are key. I should also mention a major Facebook initiative that Chris Weasler, a Tuck alum, has sort of kicked off, and that's the internet.org initiative at Facebook. It relies on public-private partnerships to provide free service in developing countries. I don't think Cuba is the perfect candidate for it today because it also relies on local telecom companies to offer the service. The incentive for local telecoms is that they get to brand their services with the Facebook name. And Facebook's got a lot of data, sort of marketing propaganda they send to these telecoms to say, once telecoms sign up with internet.org, paying subscribers actually double in a certain time horizon of offering the free service. So it's a way to sort of channel people into a paid service. The second takeaway is that companies need to plan for significant capital investment. I don't think we can get around all of Cuba's infrastructure constraints with products like Skype Lite. The third takeaway is that locally tailored workarounds, like the Airbnb example, have been wildly successful, but they tend to be operationally less efficient and less profitable. Fourth takeaway, I should say, a platform strategy such as the internet.org example I just mentioned, I think is key here, especially if we're looking to overcome some of the political hurdles at play in Cuba. And finally, firms' mobile-first strategies when entering developing countries such as India, thinking of technologies like mobile payment services that are offered in India may be the next logical step as the Visas and MasterCards of the world, for example, look to enter Cuba and sort of smooth out some of these hurdles they have today from lack of digital payments infrastructure. That's it for today, and I'd love to answer any questions you might have.